Hello, everyone, and welcome to this session with Professor Partha Dasgupta, who is Frank Ramsey Professor Emeritus of Economics at the University of Cambridge. We're going to discuss his review on the economics of biodiversity, which the UK government commissioned him to do. I'm John Orchard, OMFIF's CEO, who will be asking Professor Dasgupta a few questions, and then after that we've got a panel of experts who will look at the theme of biodiversity. Professor Dasgupta, please give us a quick overview of the scope and purpose of the report, and then we'll explore your findings and recommendations. A very meaty, I think, 600-page report, but if you can summarize it in 3 bullet points, that would be very handy.
Well, I was commissioned to prepare a global independent review of the economics of biodiversity. The review ended up being one focusing not so much on biodiversity explicitly, but instead on capital assets, which in the context of the biosphere are ecosystems, which are missing in much of economic analysis. So the idea was to bring ecosystems into economic discourse. And ecosystems, as you well know, can be very tiny, they can be very large, biomes like the open oceans in the one case. Tiny as your own mouth, for example, is an ecosystem, as is mind. So these are capital assets churning out services, and they're interrelated with one another. Just as a factory is, you have services coming in from various sectors, constituents of a factory, and they go to combine to produce the output of a factory. Likewise here. The only thing is, many of the services are they all are fundamental. Without them, we're dead. So the whole human economy is embedded in nature, and therefore takes as inputs the services that Mother Nature offers. But the problem is, however, many of them come free. There are no property rights to them. And that's the source of the difficulty and why you are now concerned about it, and why the Treasury is interested in offering green bonds as to why not let the market do it? Well, the market can't handle it because many of these goods are free. So you have assets which you're using, but they come free. So obviously we overuse them.
So I think one statistic I read in the report, you say estimates suggest we require 1.6 Earths to maintain the world's current living standards, which suggests that our current financial and economic model, which is predicated on perpetual growth within essentially a closed system, is doomed to failure in this regard. So would you say that our current economic and financial model is fundamentally incompatible with the sustainability of our environment, in your view? Let's start with that.
Oh, yes, very much so. And the reason is something that any economist would grasp if it's pointed out to them. You've got a whole bunch of scarce resources which are coming free. So obviously you're going to overuse them. In fact, entrepreneurs are going to innovate in directions which do not only not economize on nature, but are profligate in nature, because those are the cheap assets to use. So that's pretty clear. I should say, though, that the 1.6 Earths that you just quoted is a nice dramatic way of talking about it, but these are the idea that we are overusing Mother Nature's work and therefore degrading it, overextending ourselves. It comes from not only economics, but from ecology and the earth sciences as well. Pretty much all studies point in the same direction. We're overusing it, and of course we economists understand why. So we need to alter our institutions, that's for sure, to somehow or the other make up for the fact that many markets are missing.
Well, let's explore. Let's walk back from this enormous problem back to the Treasury and its green bonds step by step, and what can be done. You talk about natural capital. You're talking about the environment being free, and you introduce the idea of natural capital. Tell us what that is, how to measure it, and how to create it. How would you introduce these values into the financial and economic system?
Right. The first thing that I think a company ought to do is to hire some ecologists. They don't have them. And then they will tell you that these are assets, just as you would hire engineers to handle engineering problems in a factory. You should hire ecologists to tell you what the productivity of ecosystems are. And ecosystems will include, for example, just to give you examples, take a wetland. Now it's offering a huge number of services to us, to people in the neighborhood, as well as, of course, because nature is mobile, unlike furniture, which can be grounded on earth. This is mobile, so deterioration in one part of the ecosystem will transmit itself to other parts, just as pollution travels, okay? So given that, you can ask the question, what does a wetland offer us in terms of services? Well, I can think of at least two just to begin with, as use value. One is, of course, it harbors pollinators, and these pollinators are pollinating neighboring farms. And you can try and estimate the productivity of this particular action, namely pollination. And many, many studies have done that. It can be done and has been done. Another is it cleans water, natural cleansing processes. Now, if you destroy a wetland because, say, you create a road system which destroys it or deteriorates it, then, of course, its cleansing power of water will be reduced. And now, that clean water is being used by other people. And the question is, how do you replace it? Well, one way would be to create a factory, a filtration plant. Well, that's going to cost you money. So you can see how you can actually tease out the benefits of these ecosystems, which are not being reflected in market prices. So that's the way to do it.
Just to explore that in more detail, there seem to be several steps between the immediate benefit to an individual or a company and the net benefit to a country or the environment. So how do you create a linkage between the two? A person driving across a wetland might not take any immediate drawback from doing so. They may take one later on in aggregate.
Indeed, but this kind of problem, of course, appears elsewhere too. Never mind the environment. When there are these externalities, there's a clear case for tax subsidy solutions, as in one particular way. And then, of course, we have command systems. Do not enter.
Right. Protected
zone is one. That's a draconian way of protecting an ecosystem which you feel is productive, needs to be protected, because otherwise people will go into it. Yeah, there would be entry charges. That's another possibility. Now, take an example of a global public good, which will really probably make you surprised. It would make you sit up, is we have the oceans, open oceans. And that's about 65% of Earth's surface. It's free of charge. We can just go and sail across it, ship containers across it, oil tankers and so forth, and go on deep sea diving as well, and the fishing, okay? But there's no rent charge for it. Well, what do you expect then? You would expect it to be overused. Yep. It'll be a dumping ground for pollution, as well as over-harvesting of the materials that are there. And that's going to get destroyed gradually. It'll take time because the oceans are large, but on the other hand, our capacity to ruin capital assets is pretty big too. So we have a tendency of doing that. What would be a solution to it? It would be, presumably would be in the case of the oceans, a natural solution would be to have an international regulatory agency to charge for the use of these. So there are market-based solutions or price-guided solutions, if you like. That's the right way of putting it. Even if it's not a formal market, you could certainly have price-guided solutions to it. And I suspect, and that's presumably what's going to happen when you choose investment projects whose private profitability, given the price structure and prevailing, is insufficient, but the social profitability is large.
So in terms of logic, you would see something a bit like carbon pricing, but extended to a much wider set of things.
Exactly. Carbon pricing is the same idea. Think of pollution as the negative of conservation. That's the right way to think about it. So when you say carbon emission is a pollutant at the moment because we are emitting too much relative to what the atmosphere can absorb, think of the atmosphere as the sink, and that's the asset which you're degrading by emitting carbon into it beyond its natural limits. So the 1.6 that we were talking about, if we could try to translate it into the carbon problem, would be like saying that the rate at which you are emitting carbon, we are emitting currently, is of an amount that could only be sustained if there were 1.6 atmospheres, as opposed to 1 atmosphere, if you see what I mean. So always think of pollution as the negative of conservation, and then the whole set of issues become unified.
I want to go back to something you said a moment ago, which is that companies should employ ecology officers. Should is an interesting modal verb. It can mean ought to, or it can mean must. I can imagine companies may, for investor relations purposes, hire an ecology officer, or for acquiring millennial clients or something, but I can't imagine them having to do it. Do you think they should be made to do it?
No, look, there are many ways of thinking about it. At the moment, they don't have any particular incentive to do it. If they're let loose and
Exactly.
there are a whole bunch of free goods, why should they bother? So they could bother if you have a CEO who wants to create a reputation for the firm, because he or she anticipates that consumers are now becoming more and more concerned about the state of the environment. What are you doing for us, as it were? Okay, that's a risky thing to do because you're doing it unilaterally. Let's say hiring, ecologists and telling you how to handle your sources of primary products that you're importing from another country and converting into a finished product that you're selling here. Okay, and if you destroy the ecosystems from which you're taking your primary products, then your own profitability will decline. Now, if you have a very short time horizon, then you don't care, but that's a problem that arises everywhere else. We hear about short-termism, nothing to do with necessarily the environment. So there's nothing unique about that problem. Okay, if you have a short-term viewpoint, there's nothing we can do other than make them think long-term. Okay, but there is a possibility of a ethically minded or a CEO who decides that he is going to take the leap and invest in the source of supply, say in Africa or Asia or wherever the primary products are being imported, to ensure that it doesn't degrade through overuse. Okay, invest in it, as it were, and then advertise that fact that we are doing this in order to generate interest and perhaps build up a reputation. But relying on that is going to be tricky because not all CEOs will be interested in doing that. However, the fact that nature is mobile also means that the risks associated with overuse of the primary products, the source of the primary products, I mean, the ecosystems from which you're taking material and shipping over and then transforming and selling it, those risks are correlated across firms. So two firms which are importing primary products from neighboring ecosystems in, say, Africa or South America or wherever, typically will face correlated risks, because if one goes down, the other goes down too, if they're neighboring ones, okay, for the same reason as I've already mentioned. Now, if there's correlated risks, positively correlated risks, then of course insurance is not going to be forthcoming in the extent to which you expect, because insurance markets don't work well if they're correlated risks. So what gives? Well, the alternative is for the firms to collude and say, well, look, we have to manage it together. We have to be collective interest in doing that. And one way of doing that would be, of course, to ask or collude means what? Then each has to monitor the others, and that could be very problematic. So another possibility would be, which the review explores, is for firms to ask the state to insist that they disclose their entire supply chain. Because supply disclosure would be a substitute for the fact that there are a huge amount of missing markets arising out of, in this case, moral hazard, because nobody can actually observe what a firm is typically doing it throughout the entire sequence of events along the supply chain. But it's in the firm's interest to do that, because then the profitability increases, because what each firm does affects the other firms in terms of the source of the supply.
We know that in Europe there is a move towards non-financial disclosure obligations which relate to this area. So there is plenty moving in your direction. I want to move away from markets briefly in a moment to talk about education, which you also raised. But I've got an audience question which is similar to the question I've just put. It's worth putting in full, Professor Dasgupta. It's from Dan Waters at Vanguard, who says, the problem, of course, that if natural assets are free, as you said, Professor Dasgupta, they are, no private company is going to price them. because that will create an immediate competitive disadvantage. So do you believe, Professor Dasgupta, that governments are going to step in and price these externalities and force companies to internalize them in their cost structures so that destructive action can be reversed? It's a summary of the discussion we've just had, I think, but how would you answer?
Well, I can't predict what governments are going to do. I don't know the dynamics involved in these political negotiations between the private sector and government. So
sure.
It's beyond my reach. All I can do is to lay bare as far as I can do, as far as I am able to, the dynamics involved in the economic arrangements. And I was trying to point out that there is a sense in which there is collective interest among private companies to ask the government to tie their hands. Tying your hand can be very beneficial to you, by the way, in any collective, in a collective enterprise where what I do affects you and what you do affects me. We tend to ask for tying of our hands. In fact, having the legal system is tying our hands. I mean, it's, the fundamental basis on which society hangs rests on our agreement that we should tie our hands, not do this, not do that, and so forth. That will restrict our individual freedom, but collectively we are much better off.
I mean, the implication of Dan's question is that there is a first mover disadvantage. We shouldn't
exactly
rely too much on the beneficial instincts of these companies. So probably regulation would need to force their hands in concert and at the same time. Would you agree with that?
That is exactly what I was suggesting previously, yes. The only thing is, the way you're posing it, you expressed it, suggests that you're asking them to beat up on your head, as it were. I wasn't. It'll be more like, give us this additional service, government, says the private company. We need it, because otherwise we don't have the individual incentive to further our own interests, our private interest. That my firm's private interest increases if you come into play and tell us that we all must disclose. But we all must. It's not just me who will have to disclose, others too.
Just on that point, relates to a discussion that comes up in lots of our sessions, not just on sustainability, but on digital money and all sorts of other regulatory issues. In digital money, it's called interoperability. In this sector, obviously there would be a huge disadvantage as well, not just for companies going first, the countries going first potentially. So how do you see countries achieving this in concert? Would it be something like the tax agreement of the OECD or something that COP26 decides together all at once? Otherwise it probably wouldn't work.
That's very much the case. You are now moving from the individual player is no longer the firm, company, let alone the household, not the company, but the state. And exactly the similar argument comes into play. But I'm asking for more, because I'm also suggesting that it's not just a question of agreement on regulations, but it could well be that you actually institute charges for the use of global public goods, like I mentioned earlier about the seas. And of course, also, our countries need to come to terms with the fact that the rainforests, our tropical rainforests, are dying, and they're being cut down to nothing through the individual nations' activities. And they will claim that we have a right to do that because we need to develop. That's a standard argument you've heard about deforestation of the Amazon and so forth. Okay. Now, straightforward economic reasoning suggests that we ought to be subsidizing them, paying for them to maintain the forests. Payment for ecosystem services is now becoming quite I wouldn't say a commonplace, but it's becoming more frequent or common in Costa Rica, in this country even, and China too, where you pay farmers for the provision of services that you're actually enjoying, because you're worried that they wouldn't do that, and then in which case you don't get that service anymore. So there are sort of implicit markets coming along. Likewise, in the international case, we should be subsidizing, paying for the services of maintaining these rainforests for these countries. That will require huge negotiation, no question about it. There's bargaining involved, but there's bargaining involved everywhere, no question about that too. And in order to pay for that, you could raise rents from the use of the oceans, and that's the package that my review suggests. So at the international level, yes, there's a huge amount of work that could be tackled. Ideas that could be tackled for COP15 and COP26 and COP15. But as of now, I don't see that happening. But there is a related question, which is, of course, the government itself, the state itself, could invest in nature because as a complement to the private sector. And this, of course, for example, infrastructure investment is undertaken routinely by states. Why? Because the argument is that they have huge economies of scale and companies can't handle it. Here it's not economies of scale, but externalities.
I've got an additional couple of audience questions on this theme that both excellent. So Ray Taylor, founder of AllFed, who says, as an economist, how would you want to see political actors take on or negotiate with coal or oil lobbyists in DC, Delhi, Australia, brackets, realistically? In other words, our point before about first mover disadvantages in a number of countries which are still in the development phase and don't see why they should worry too much about sustainability just yet, potentially.
Yeah, I mean, there's some of these questions, the way they're posed, look as though they're impossible to answer. The way it's being posed, I can't possibly give an answer to them. There are first mover disadvantage at the level of the household. We do that all the time. We see that every day in your neighborhood. There are first mover disadvantages at the level of the company and so forth. Okay, and now you're talking about nations. That's for sure.
Yeah,
absolutely. But on the other hand, in the case of the example that you just now mentioned regarding developing countries using the argument that, look, why it should be I gave you an example of the rainforest belong to us. We are doing it. We're going to convert them into cattle ranches so we can export the beef to you guys. And who are you to tell us not to do that?
Yeah, exactly.
Well, then you should pay for it. Yeah. If you care about their protection, which we do, then we ought to pay for it. Now, of course, one country can't do that, and hence is precisely for that reason I was suggesting that we are missing a trick here in COP26 and COP15 in not beginning a discussion of international cooperation in the way previous generations did over the establishment of the World Bank and the IMF. How did they come about? Yeah. Presumably there was a lot of disagreement about that too.
Yeah.
But those institutions were fielded because they were designed to supply certain global public goods which otherwise would not have been provided. In this case, not in environment, but financial stability in the case of IMF, reconstruction and development in the case of the World Bank. Now, they had the imagination to do that.
Right.
And I'm suggesting that we ought to have the imagination to solve a parallel problem of global public goods, which are supplied by Mother Nature, and we're not doing it.
That's an interesting, useful comparison. Thank you, Professor Dasgupta. Richard Berner, professor at the NYU Stern School of Business, asks whether you believe that price or quantity regulation is superior, or do we need both?
Wow, very good question. Yeah, we need both, of course, depending on these are instruments, okay? There's nothing religious about it. These are instruments for furthering human well-being. And if you want to add nature to it, you can say to include the health of nature per se. Never mind, they're used to us. Typically, quantity restrictions are useful when there are sort of uncertain damages, risky damages that you don't quite know where the damage lies, where the threshold lies, where the tipping point is, and so forth. And you're worried about that. And so you forestall any possibility by saying no further. Don't encroach any further. Protected zones will be an example of that. But for many other cases, for example, in the case of payment for ecosystem services, no rationing was required there. It was just a pure payment, an agreement that I will pay you for each year. I will pay for the amount of clean water I receive from the fact that you're sitting on a wetland and I'm a recipient of the benefits. So I think there's no religion here. It's a pure technical issue, whichever is viable. And when I say technical, I don't mean just economic. It's also, of course, politically feasible.
Okay. In the interest of time, to move on quickly to two other themes. Firstly, you're suggesting modifying the way we talk about economic wealth. I think that's also important, how finance ministries measure their own progress and that of their peers. Tell us how you would overhaul that.
Well, you've used the word wealth, but actually our national accounts don't offer us wealth statistics. They offer us GDP statistics, which are flawed. These are, so many $1 trillion per year. Okay, so these are flows, and the weakness of these flow measures is that they do not take into account the depreciation of capital assets. So GDP could be growing, but if it grows at the expense of the assets on the basis of which this output is being created, then you're missing the trick. You're hiding that information. And the thing is that in the future, it's going to be in trouble. You will be in trouble. Just as, for example, a company which is importing raw materials, let's say from an ecosystem in another country, and doesn't take care to see that it's protected, will find one day that actually supplies are not going to be forthcoming, in which case that's going to affect profitability. So the thing is to create an inventory of stocks. We should move from flows to stocks as the basis on which we decide whether this year was an improvement on the previous year for the economy as a whole. Now, the idea of wealth is, of course, to put a price on the stocks, add them up and say that's our wealth. That's what a household would do. But for many of these stocks, prices are not going to be forthcoming because market prices are zero. And you have to look at the productivity of these stocks and use what we call accounting prices to create a sense of wealth. Even that's going to be very hard. So typically, what the review does is to recommend that countries they publish the inventory of stocks. What's the health of the ecosystem in some measure of health, extent, maybe forest cover, that sort of thing. Okay, and so that you get an idea of the direction in which the economy is moving. But the basic idea is like firms have balance sheets. Nations should have balance sheets. It's not just income expenditure. I'm not suggesting you do away with GDP, but it should not be used for judging whether an economy is performing well or not, or what we are handing over to our children or the next year.
If we were to start tomorrow, which sounds like we should, we're attributing prices to the environment in terms of national wealth. Who should do that? Would that be the existing accountancy firms? Should a state agency do it? How might it come about in the first instance?
Well, again, at the national level, the National Statistical Office, which supplies the nation's economic accounts, that will be the ultimate arbitrator of that. Obviously, goes without saying. Now, where they get the information is a different matter. They'll come from firms. There'll be lots of capital assets which are not actually owned. They'll be called public lands, let's say. Okay. Now, somebody has to measure what the public land looks like. Has it deteriorated? Is it as healthy as it was the previous year? And that's where you need ecologists, that's for sure. And the idea I'm trying to explore in the review and try and make popular is the fact that we should regard nature at the first cut as essentially a productive asset. And then never mind, intrinsic value, sacredness, and so forth. You come to that later. But as a first cut, it's a productive asset. And any good manager would look at his or her productive assets of his or her company and then see how are they doing. And knowing that in this case, there are problems because there will be overuse of these assets, because they don't have prices. We've gone into that. But nevertheless, you need to then find out what you're losing and take steps. Maybe public investment in some of these assets, maybe subsidies to companies to engage in those similar investments. Those are details. I mean, we faced that in so many other things, over health, education. We've been discussing this for 50, 60 years, right? How much should the private sector enter? How much should the public sector be involved, and so forth? I don't think this should be made any more mysterious. In the case
it sounds to me, thank you, Professor Dasgupta. We're now, it sounds to me like 1,000 years after the first Doomsday Book, at least in this country, we need to do that again, but with tax officials accompanied by ecologists. So let's hope that takes place. We could hardly done this theme justice, this huge and important theme justice, but it's very kind of you to give us a flavour of your thinking today. So thank you very much for that. And do join all of you listening, my former colleague Helen Avery, who's going to explore this theme with her excellent panel on biodiversity. So thank you very much, everyone, for listening. And thank you, Professor Dasgupta. Very good to see you.
Good to see you too.
Thank you.